Hi, I'm Ed Brookmeyer, and I'd like to welcome you to this special edition of All Things Jewish. Many of you might have seen the award-winning Steven Spielberg movie Schindler's List. You might have wondered, can such a story really be true? What does it take to survive an ordeal like the Holocaust? What type of person was Oskar Schindler? How do you make sense of your life again after such an experience? Tonight, somewhat in response to the recent Iranian-style neo-Nazi Holocaust denials that were aired on Framingham Public TV and written about in the Metro West Daily News and the Jewish Advocate, we are privileged to have with us longtime Framingham resident and Holocaust victim and Schindler survivor, Rena Finder.
I am a survivor of the Holocaust. Therefore, I am an eyewitness to some of the most horrific crimes committed against innocent people whose only crime that they were Jewish. By the Germans, whom we always consider to be a very cultured state. But I am also a survivor on Schindler's List, and therefore I am an eyewitness to the difference that one man can do when he decides not to stand by quietly and watch murder of innocent people. I was born in Kraków, Poland, a beautiful ancient city. I'm an only child. I lived with my parents right around the corner from a beautiful ancient castle. And I had a wonderful, wonderful childhood. We had a huge family. My father was one of 8 brothers, had lots of loving cousins and aunts and uncles. I went to school around the corner from my house, and life was good. I was always aware of the anti-Semitism that was in Poland. And I remember hearing stories about the pogroms. I also remember going to 1st grade and having one little girl calling me a dirty Jew. I came home crying. I asked my mother, how can anybody call me dirty Jew? I just took a shower this morning. But being young, I didn't pay much attention to the politics. And all this changed on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. And overnight, from being a little girl, I became an enemy of the state. All our civil rights were taken away from us. Jewish people were not allowed to own businesses. Our bank accounts were confiscated. Our businesses were confiscated. We were not allowed to go to the temple anymore. Our temples and synagogues were burned or turned into stables. But most of all, we realized that the Germans were planning to separate us, to segregate us, and in the end, to kill us. The Jewish people had to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David, and we were not allowed to walk on the sidewalks. We were not allowed to own pets, and we were not allowed to remain in Kraków. Anybody under 12 and anybody over 55 would not be allowed to remain in Kraków. We were told that those people would be resettled, sent to farms, to work for the farmers, to make food for the German army. And the rest of us who would get the permit would be resettled into the ghetto. I was very lucky. I was tall for my age, so even though I was 10 years old, my parents were able to falsify my birth certificate. And I remember when we went to the headquarters, and stood in line to obtain our permits. We were surrounded by what it seemed to me hundreds and hundreds of German soldiers. They were armed not only with guns, but also with dogs that were trained to tear us apart. And I remember standing in front of this huge building in the big, beautiful square, where life was normal for the Polish people. And there we stood, and nobody paid any attention to us. Nobody saw us, nobody heard us, nobody cared. Trucks came and started to take the children away from the parents. The parents were crying, begging for mercy. There was no mercy from any of the German soldiers. There was no mercy for the Jewish people. Within a few weeks, of population of about 40,000 in Krakow, only about 20,000 people remained. The rest was gone, and we never heard about them again. My parents and I had to leave our home, the only home I ever knew. That's where I was born, and we had to resettle into the ghetto. The ghetto was part of the old part of the city, and we were assigned a small room. We were not allowed to take our belongings with us, and I remember leaving everything behind, walking away from clothes and food and dishes, and my father was able to get a pushcart. We loaded the pushcart with some bedding, some pots and pans, and we left our home. I remember trying to say goodbye to some of my neighbors that we were very friendly with, but somehow nobody seemed to be home. And so as we walked away, and I turned around and I looked back at my building, and I saw all our neighbors peering at us from behind closed windows and closed curtains. We walked across the bridge, across the river Vistula, and we walked into the ghetto. It was an area about 2 avenues long, about 4 blocks wide. There were so many thousands of people and so little room. We had a very tiny room, which we shared with 2 other families. It was in a very old building. And at the same time, my father was saying, don't worry, it's not going to last. It will end soon. The world will hear what's happening to us, and they will come and save us. In the meantime, in the ghetto, the Jewish committee established workshops so that everybody would be employed and everybody would be working. As long as we were working, we were slaves, we were a good workforce, and we felt the Germans would let us live. And there were some people who were allowed to leave the ghetto, and they were working with German patrols outside of the ghetto. And one of them was a factory called Emalia. This factory became the famous Emalia factory that was owned by Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler was a German, born in Czechoslovakia. And before the war, he traveled a lot. He was a salesman. He used to come to Krakow a lot, and he liked Krakow. Oskar Schindler became a member of the Nazi Party because he was very ambitious, and he wanted to become rich. And so as he followed the Germans into Krakow, and he obtained the factory, he was also able to obtain a beautiful apartment, and he was able to make a lot of money, which is what he wanted to do. By obtaining the factory, which was a factory that was making pots and pans before the war, Oskar Schindler, who knew nothing about running the business, befriended the people who owned and ran the factory before the war. Oskar Schindler, even though he was a member of the Nazi Party, did not have the heart of a Nazi. The Jewish people that worked for him, took care of his business, became his friends. And because Oskar Schindler had so many influential friends in the German government, he was able to bribe them, entertain them, and obtain many permits from them that ordinarily he wouldn't be able to. And so he converted part of the factory for making ammunition, and therefore he was able to employ more and more Jewish people. Oskar Schindler's fame became very dangerous for him too, because everybody in the ghetto heard how wonderful it was to work for him, and people would have wanted to go and work for Oskar Schindler. The conditions in the ghetto were unbearable. We didn't have enough water, we didn't have enough electricity, and we didn't have enough food. Little children who were born in the ghetto usually died very soon after, because there was no way of keeping them well. While we saw that as long as we are working, we would be safe, we were mistaken. The German patrolled the ghetto every day and every night. And many days they would come into the factories, into the workshop, and arrest people, and people were sent away, and we never heard from them again. Every now and then there was what we call action, where the Germans would come into people's homes and take people who were without papers and arrest them and put them in the trucks and take them away, and we never heard from them before. One horrible day, there was a knock at our door at midnight, and the soldiers arrested my father and took him away, and we never saw my father again. My father was 40 years old. He was a very tall and handsome young man. And when they took my father away, I couldn't imagine how we could survive without him, because my father could manage and arrange for everybody. My father helped a lot of people trying to get the medical help, which was very, very impossible to obtain in the ghetto. After a little while, my grandparents were also arrested because they did not have the required papers, and they were taken away from us. And then the orders came that the ghetto was going to be liquidated, and we were going to be moved into concentration camp Plaszow, which was about 7 kilometers outside of the ghetto. It was a horrible day, March 3rd, 1942, where the children would not be able to leave the ghetto. Again, anybody over 55 and anybody under 12 would have to remain in the ghetto. My mother and I were taking care of my little cousin Jenny. She was 5 years old. She was beautiful. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. Do you know, Hitler wanted to have an Aryan race. He only wanted blonde people with blue eyes. But of course, you all know what Hitler looked like, with his dark hair and dark mustache, and so many of his members of his gang looked the same. Our children were so beautiful, and they were so smart. And they always kept quiet, because they always had to be hiding. But when the day came that we had to leave the ghetto, I had to leave my little cousin in the orphan's home. There were so many children in the orphanage in the ghetto, because the Germans were bringing the children from surrounding communities into the ghetto, and we thought that perhaps the nuns would come and take care of the children. And I remember as we were running out of the ghetto, I was running with my group from the workshop, and I realized that some of the people in their backpack were carrying their little children. One of my friends had a 9-month-old baby, and he was drugged. Those were the people who had some Polish friends. Those we called the righteous Gentiles. Those people who risked their lives to save a Jewish child. Not only were they in danger of the authorities, but they were in danger of the neighbor. Because if the neighbor would suspect that they were hiding a Jewish child, they would report them to the Gestapo. I remember running into the camp that night. It was such a huge camp. Men and women had separate barracks. The commander of the camp was Amon Get. Amon Get was in charge of liquidating the ghetto, and Amon Get was in charge of running the camp. Now, Amon Get was actually born in Vienna, came from a very prestigious publishing company, and we somehow always expect somebody born in Vienna would be very kind and understanding and very cultured. Amon Get was a brutal, sadistic murderer. Amon Get enjoyed killing. Amon Get had a villa in the camp, and he would stand under the villa every morning and watch the people go to work. He had a long-range rifle, and he would shoot just for the fun of it. When he got tired of it, he would come down with his huge dog and watch the women work on the road. At that time, while the camp was built on an old village and 3 Jewish cemeteries, and some of the tombstones were broken up and used for making the roads. And the women were sitting trying to make the roads. It's like trying to make a puzzle. And you never know. You never knew when Amon Get would walk by and kill somebody. One day I was sitting next to my girlfriend Stella, whose parents had been killed, and she was sort of adopted by my mother and me. She was sitting right next to me, and all of a sudden she fell over. And I put my hand behind her because I whispered to her, sit up, now is not the time to lay down. And I realized when I touched her that she was dead. There was blood in her back. Amon Get was by, and he killed her. And I didn't even realize this. It was life in the camp was unbearable. Again, we had no food, we didn't have enough water, we worked 12 hours a day, we were on a swing shift, we worked day and night, and we were always in danger of Amon Get public hanging, public execution, public beating. I remember that whenever we stood for a roll call, and Amon Get was always there, I never really looked at him. I don't really know what he looked like, because I always felt that if I don't look at him and our eyes won't meet, he won't see me. And if he won't see me, he won't kill me. Oskar Schindler became a very good friend of Amon Get because he needed him, because his people walked from the Plaszow to his factory, and some days, if Amon Get felt like it, he wouldn't let them out. Well, Amon Get became a good friend of Oskar Schindler because Oskar Schindler was always entertaining him, buying him expensive presents, so he liked him. And so one day, Oskar Schindler decided and got permission from Amon Get to build a camp next to his factory. My mother and I were very fortunate, very lucky, that we knew somebody who was making that list. And we were able to leave Plaszow and go to work for Oskar Schindler. Now, being able to leave Plaszow, it was like escaping from hell and going to heaven. Escaping a sadistic murderer and going to be taken care of by Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler camp, we had small barracks. We actually had bunk beds, where in Plaszow we had those shelves. Oskar Schindler fed us better. We had bread that actually tasted like bread and not sawdust. And the guards were not allowed into the factory. I was one of the youngest on Schindler's List, and I was assigned to work in a factory on a small machine called lace. I remember that there were mostly young people working on that machine, and we all loved it. Every day, Oskar Schindler would come into the factory and talk to his workers. And one day, one of the foremen decided to take me away from that small machine that I was doing so well, and put him on a huge press. And that press was actually shown in the movie. I worked on that machine for a couple of hours. The machine was known to be breaking down a lot. I worked on it for a couple of hours. The machine broke. The foreman accused me of sabotage, and he said he was going to call the guards, and the sentence for sabotage is death. I was crying, and everybody around was very upset. Somebody called Oskar Schindler. He came down, and he looked at the foreman, and he looked at me, and he gave orders to the foreman never to take me away from my machine and never to put another young child on that machine. And from, to us, Oskar Schindler was our hero. He was our angel. To me, he was like my second father. He did such extraordinary things, try to helping out. He tried to see to it that we had sweaters, that we had shoes. One of my friends lost his glasses, and Oskar Schindler got him a pair of glasses. One of my friends was diabetic. Oskar Schindler supplied her with insulin. It was unbelievable that one person could make such a difference while really risking his life. Because if his German so-called friends would suspect him that he's helping us, they would kill him. They are just, he always told them he expected to do well by his worker, so they would be working hard for him. Unfortunately, this didn't last very long, because there were orders to liquidate all the camps in Poland. The Germans were losing the war on the Russian front, but they were determined to win the war against the Jews. And when the camp was going to be liquidated, Amonger got a special permission from Amonger to move his factory and his workers to Brnice, Czechoslovakia, where he was born. The women were tattooed with a KL, which stands for concentration lager. It didn't hurt because it was done by Jewish doctors who didn't want to hurt us. And we were sent back to Plaszow and loaded onto the trains. We were loaded onto the trains like sardines. We couldn't move. There were so many of us, we couldn't sit, we couldn't turn. There was no water. There were no bathroom facilities. There was no food. There was no air. We had no idea where we were going. But it seemed like a very long time when the train finally stopped and the doors opened, and we were told to jump down. Some women could not. I remember getting out of the train, jumping down of the boxcar, and I looked around, and I saw the sign, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I realized that so we have heard about Auschwitz-Birkenau, we did not believe it. Came face to face with our nightmare. I remember miles and miles of barbed wires electrified. It seemed to me like there were hundreds and hundreds of German soldiers with the dogs barking and screaming. The soldiers were yelling at us, get out, heraus, mach schnell. And as we started to run, I realized that there was a terrible stench in Auschwitz. And we thought it was snowing. It was late October. And we were so thirsty, and we saw snow, and we grabbed snow, and we wanted to eat, and we realized it was ashes. After being forced to run for a few minutes, or it seemed like a very long time, we came to halt in front of a huge barrack. There in front of the huge barrack stood a young, well-dressed, well-fed SS Nazi officer, and with a flick of the wrist, he was sending some women to the left and some women to the right. And I realized that those going to the left could barely walk. So my mother and I would straighten up, would pinch our cheeks, we wanted to look healthy, and were sent to the right. Went to this huge, huge building, this huge barrack, were told to undress, totally stripped. And then we were shaved. We were shaved from top to bottom. They were cutting our hair with very blunt scissors, so they were cutting part of our scalps. And we were crying, and we were sprayed with some disinfectant, which was burning like fire. And the prisoners were telling us, you have nothing to worry about because you're going to live. You are going to the shower. And they pointed a little across the road. That's where the crematoriums are. That's where the gas chambers are. You're going to live. But we didn't believe them. And we were pushed into another room. There was no light. And again, we were crying. We had no idea what's going to happen. Then the light came on. And I looked around. I looked at my mother. I looked at all the people that I knew all my life, and I didn't recognize them. Because when they shave our hair, we were so totally dehumanized and so totally humiliated. And I said to my mother, we are dead. They had already killed us, and look, it wasn't so bad. It wasn't, we didn't suffer so much. After a short, cold shower, no soap, no towels, we were alive. But they pushed us to another room, and there were SS women guards, and they were more vicious than the men guards. At that time, they didn't give us a uniforms. There was a pile of wooden shoes on one side and a pile of clothing on another side, and they were told us they were beating us and telling us to hurry up and get dressed. So whatever you could get, I grabbed a pair of those wooden shoes. One was too small, one was too big. I saw a yellow dress with red flowers. I once had a dress like that. I thought maybe it's mine. So I pulled it out, but it was a huge, huge chiffon dress. And I had to put it over. I couldn't put it back. I had to put it over myself, and I tried to sort of tie it around me so I wouldn't trip. And we were pushed to the other side of the barrack. And then I said to my mom, now I know we are dead. Because what we saw could not exist, not in 20th century, not in the world that we knew. There's miles and miles of gray barracks, mud everywhere on the road. And the women that came out looking at us in the striped uniform dresses, they didn't look human. Sunken eyes, sunken cheeks. We were put, the 300 women on Schindler's List were put in one barrack. There weren't enough shelves to sleep on. Most of us had to sleep on the stone floor. Every morning and every night, we had to stand for a roll call. That was very dangerous because you never knew what was going to happen. If one of the soldiers didn't like you, they would take you away. Our job was to pick up mud from one side of the street, of the road, and bring it to the other side. And that's what we did every day. The women on Schindler's List were in Auschwitz-Birkenau for 3.5 weeks, which is a long time to be in Auschwitz-Birkenau, where you're waiting, you're sort of waiting in line to go to the gas chambers. When the orders came that we were going to leave, we were all very sick. We had dysentery. Some of us were swollen from hunger. We could barely walk. But we were sent again to the showers and got some different clothing, and were loaded on trains, and this time in the boxcar, we could sit. One of my friends, I remember, was laying across my lap, and she was very, very sick. She had a very high fever, and I remember trying to stick my skinny finger between the crack in the boxcar and scrape some icicles, some snow to put on her lips. About an hour after we left Auschwitz-Birkenau, she broke up in scarlet fever. If she broke up in the rush while we were still in Auschwitz-Birkenau, they would have never let us go. After all, it was infectious disease, and they would have sent us to to the gas chamber. We still didn't know where we were going, but we were hoping. And when the doors finally opened, after what it seemed like a long journey, there on the platform stood Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler in all his glory, in his green Tyrolean hat with the feather in his head, with the green Tyrolean coat and his shining boots. And that's when we found out that Oskar Schindler had sent one of his secretaries to Auschwitz to bribe the commander of Auschwitz with a bunch of diamonds to let his women come to work. And when we got to the factory, our camp was right next to the factory. Actually, it was almost part of the factory, so that we were warm. And Oskar Schindler tried again to take care of us the best he could. Mrs. Schindler came to Brünitz to help Oskar to take care of us. She had a lot of friends, and she used to go to the farms and get some extra food. Oskar and Emily Schindler had a beautiful villa in Brünitz, but they lived and slept in the small apartment of the factory floor because they were afraid to leave us, that the SS guards guarding us at the time would kill us. Some of the people that work with Oskar Schindler, some of our Jewish young men, very smart, and one of them, who became the Supreme Court Justice in Israel after the war, was a very good forger. So Oskar and his gang were forging a lot of documents. One of the documents was to send the commander of the group that was guarding us, and they gave him a telegram from Berlin that Hitler wanted to see him. So he left. And when he left, Oskar Schindler saw to it that the guards were well fed and supplied with a lot of vodka, so they didn't care what we were doing. Most of the machines that were moved to Brünitz really didn't work very well. And Oskar Schindler gave strict orders for us not to make anything that would work. A couple of times, Oskar Schindler had to buy the shells that we were supposed to make to send it to the Russian front for the German soldiers, because he had to show that he was doing something. The last 7 months of the war where hundreds and thousands of Jewish people died on the death march. The Germans marched people from Auschwitz and all other camps into Germany in the most horrible winter of 1945. There were blizzards and way below freezing every day. People had no food, they had no clothing. They're falling by wayside. They were killed, they froze to death. The road from Poland to Germany was covered with corpses and blood. Those of us on Schindler's List were warm. We were hungry. It was hard for Oskar and Emily Schindler to give us find enough food for us, but we were not starving. And when the war was ending, Oskar Schindler invited all of us into the factory to listen to the broadcast, BBC, Winston Churchill, announcing that the war has ended. And Oskar Schindler announced that he and his family would have to leave. We were going to be liberated by the Russians. Oskar Schindler had to leave to be liberated by the Americans. The Russian would shoot him first without asking questions, because he was a member of the SS party. He was a manufacturer of ammunition, and he employed Jewish slaves. The fact that by employing us, he saved our lives would not have meant anything to the Russians. We all gathered to say goodbye to Oskar and Emily Schindler. We all cried. We wrote affidavits explaining how he had saved us. And surrounded by 12 young men from our group, Oskar and Emil Schindler left towards Austria. The Czech underground made sure that we were safe, and the remaining young men in the camp were armed, and so were the young men who escorted Oskar Schindler to Austria. And so we were left alone for the first time, with no guards and no Oskar Schindler. We sat and waited. We were afraid to leave. We were told not to leave the camp because we were still in danger of the German soldiers retreating. As a matter of fact, one truck stopped by the camp and wanted to know who was in it, and our people told them they were all, our young men were all dressed in German uniforms, and they told them that we were all sick from diphtheria and typhus, so they didn't go near us. After a few days, finally, one Russian soldier showed up. I remember I saw he was on a donkey. And he told us, "You are now liberated by the superior, victorious Russian army." And we wanted to know, is anybody left in Krakow? And he said, "No, and don't go there. Nobody wants you." But of course, that's where we came from, and that's where we went. My mother, my grandfather, who was on Schindler's List, we went back to Krakow. The Russian arranged a transport back to Krakow for all of us. And when we arrived in Krakow, we found that my father, his 6 brothers, my little cousins, my aunts and uncles, my mother's parents, sisters, brothers, little cousins, they were all murdered. We stood in front of the building where we lived. There were many children for me to play with before the war. I was an only child that came back because of Oskar Schindler. So you see, if it was not for Oskar Schindler, I would not survive. Oskar Schindler gave us life, gave me a chance to grow up, to get married, to have children, and to have grandchildren. Because we are all getting older, the survivors feel very strongly, as eyewitnesses, we must tell our stories. And hopefully we can pass the torch of remembrance to the 2nd and 3rd generation and those yet to come, and for all those who hear us. Because everything that you heard about Oskar Schindler, or if you had seen the movie, everything is true. And Oskar Schindler and Emil Schindler are the shining examples that one person, one man, one woman can make a difference. And we try to inspire children to believe that they have the power to make a difference. Each and every one of us has the power to change things, make a difference, to understand that you cannot stand by and ignore somebody who is bullying another person. You have to take action. You have to be you have to be an upstander and not a bystander. It is especially important for the survivors to tell our story, because there is so many people who try to deny that Holocaust ever happened. There are in Berlin hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles and miles of reports, of records that the Germans very carefully kept about how they killed and murdered 6 million Jews. Now, not all the Jews were victims, but not all the victims were Jews. They were prisoners of war. They were political prisoners. They were people who had different political aspirations. And it is so important that we teach the children the truth, that they will remember that Holocaust can never be forgotten. so it will never happen again. It is happening now in many, many places. It happened in Sarajevo, it happened in Kosovo, it happened in Somalia, it happened in Darfur, where innocent people, innocent children, are being murdered by thousands. And we cannot stand by and allow this to happen. Thank you.
Lie, 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 lie.